أبا بكر دعوتك لو أجبت إلى ما فيه حظك لو عقلت إلى علم تكون به إماما.
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه وبارك وسلم. In this episode, we'll talk about how did the Sharia prohibited riba. We hear and we read in the books of tafsir and from different scholars that riba was not prohibited at one single moment. Like khamr, alcohol, how alcohol has been made haram for us to consume it in 4 different stages as we see in the Quran. Like zina, how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made it haram into 2 different stages. Similarly, riba has also maybe made haram into 4 different stages. That means it took 4 different stages to reach to the point where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said that riba is haram now. The reason why is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made the tahrim in stages is that these things, drinking of alcohol, zina and riba, was so common and it was so flooded in the Arab al-Jahiliyyah that by seeing only once that no, from today the riba is haram, today there is no zina, from today onwards no khamr, the people would not have accepted Islam. They would not have been steadfast on the religion. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala slowly and on different occasions helped them to get rid of these things, the destructive things, and made the riba haram. The first stage where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about to the people of Arab about the riba, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala began talking to them and condemning riba for the people, for the people of Ahlul Kitab, like for example Yahud, they used to deal in riba, their living was on riba. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala began by them because the people of Yahud were there at that time, and the Arab al-Jahiliyyah in their travel to many different countries, they used to deal with them as well, and they knew the whereabouts of trade and how the Yahud people, they used to trade and work. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala told about them and introduced and condemned this act of taking and giving riba that the Yahud used to practice. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has mentioned in the Quran, من الذين هادوا حرمنا عليهم من الطيبات أحلت لهم وبصدهم عن سبيل الله كثيرا وأخذهم الربا وقد نهوا عنه. That these people used to take riba and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had stopped them as well. They had received this message from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Their prophets has also given them this message, this risala, this tabligh, to stop dealing in riba. But they continued to deal in riba, as discussed in the last episode, how the riba destructs the individuals and how it destructs the community and society and then the whole country and its economy. They got the prey to it. They became the prey for such a society, for such a such a disease. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala signposted the people of Arab by mentioning al-Yahud and how is the dealing. The second thing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala introduces them and tells them by giving them the differentiation between riba and zakat. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَمَا آتَيْتُم مِّن رِّبًا لِيَرْبُوا فِي أَمْوَالِ النَّاسِ فَلَا يَرْبُوا عِندَ اللَّهِ وَمَا آتَيْتُم مِّن زَكَاةٍ تُرِيدُونَ وَجْهَ اللَّهِ فَأُولَٰئِكَ هُمُ الْمُضْعِفُونَ. That whatever you give as riba, right, it is not increasing in the eye of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or it's not pleasing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Means what? You give money for riba, 10 dirhams, you receive 20 dirhams, let's say. This increase of 20 dirham is not an increase that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala considers it. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not happy with this increase. It does not please Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But when you give money for zakah, this is where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala becomes happy, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala doubles this money for you, even though you cannot see. It may be doubled in any other form. This is the second differentiation that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala told and introduced to these Arabs al-Jahiliyyah, so that they started to learn about the differentiation of between riba and between zakah. How this riba can be doubled, is not being doubled, and how zakat is being doubled, so that you learn to give without taking any return for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, so that, because when you are giving a riba, you are always wanting to receive something back in double. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, opposite to it, explained and gave an example of zakah, that instead of just giving and hoping for to take and more, just give. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will double it. Because you want to see the double money you lend and you receive, want to receive it in double. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala here in this example is talking and telling that the money that you give for zakah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala doubles it, and you must do this for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Because when the Arabs, they used to give their money to the needy people, so it's not kind of helping them out, rather than taking them and their needs as a form of business and making them more needy. Where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has encouraged them, they are in need, you give them money, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will double this money for you and give to you in any other form. This is the second way. The third stage where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells and starts negating the Arab to not to imitate taking riba, and a riba that is doubled and tripled to the extent that it reaches its capital money. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, يَا أَيُّهَا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا لَا تَأْكُلُوا الرِّبَا أَضْعَافًا مُضَاعَفًا. This is the third stage where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells the people, oh, you believers, do not take the amount of riba in doubles, like in excessive percentage, to the extent that this excessive percentage reaches towards to your capital. And this ayah directs us to riba and where, because the Arabs used to practice, when they used to lend money to the person in need, so they used to say that, okay, you have a time period of 1 year, and you need to, when you return the money, you need to add 5% of the capital money and give it back to me in 1 year. When the time frame used to come, they would say the person, will you pay us in full, that means including the riba, or will you continue the loan? So if they would say, okay, we will continue the loan, then they would say, okay, Now since you are continuing the loan and you are delaying it, we will charge from you, it was 5%, now it is 9%, for example. And the loan gets increased and increased and increased to the extent that now person is paying the capital money that he took from the lender, and he is, while returning, he is returning double amount of that capital money to this. And this form of muamala or transaction is normally done in the banks, and we see lots of banks, they practice this kind of dealing, which is very brutal for the individual and for the society as well. Moving forward, the fourth stage, and this is the final stage where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala full stopped on a person dealing with riba. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, الَّذِينَ يَأْكُلُونَ الرِّبَا لَا يَقُومُونَ إِلَّا كما يقوم الذي يتخبطه الشيطان من المس ذلك بأنهم قالوا إنما البيع مثل الربا وأحل الله البيع وحرم الربا. Here is the place where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala finally negates and finally stops the person from dealing in riba, and mentions that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has made the bay', the transaction, the dealings halal, and the riba haram. Because in these three stages there was a question that people used to ask, that what is the difference between bay' and riba? In bay', I'm buying this mobile phone for, let's say, 1,000 dirham, right? My cost was 500 dirhams. I'm also getting an increase and a benefit from this. Whereas when I lend money to someone, 500, and I'm taking from him back 1,000, these two transactions are same. I'm earning here 500 extra, and I'm also earning here 500 extra. There is no difference in that. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala replies to these people and says, وَأَحَلَّ اللَّهُ الْبَيْعَ وَحَرَّمَ الرِّبَا. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has made the bay', the buying of this mobile phone halal, and doing this transaction of lending money with the increase in return as haram. And to the extent that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, for the person who does not stop dealing in riba, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that Allah and His Rasul announces the war against such a person. Allah Akbar. Allah and His Rasul announce war against such a person who does not stop dealing in riba, even after Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala prohibited it. This is a very strong ayah. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala comes against someone, Allah's Rasul comes against such a person, how will that person succeed? How? Is there any way where that person, despite of being billion dollars worth, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that me and my Rasul has announced a war against the person. This war will be in dunya and it will be in akhirah as well. The more zulm that you did in accumulating that wealth, be it in riba, by the means of riba, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will hold you on the day of judgment. And this is act of war. You as a person announced act of war. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has also announced act of war against you. There is no other place in the Quran where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says like that, mentions to the people for who, those who act, those who deal in riba. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَمَنْ عَادَ فَأُولَٰئِكَ أَصْحَابُ النَّارِ هُمْ فِيهَا خَالِدُونَ يَمْحَقُ اللَّهُ الرِّبَا وَيُرْبِي الصَّدَقَاتِ. The person who gives sadaqat, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala increases this thing. This is where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is directing that replace riba with bay, and instead of riba bring sadaqat, bring zakat, because this is where you will actually, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will double for you the money, which is the best for you and for your business, for your life, to survive as a means for your profession and things of that nature. Do the bay'. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has kept all the khair of dunya in terms of money, or majority of it, in the bay'. Do the bay'. Instead of riba or dealing in riba, it's better you deal in sadaqat and zakat. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will double this money for you. And we also see many ahadith that has come in this regard of negating and prohibiting for the person who deals in riba. There's ulama, Allama Mawardi. He says Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has never, according to his opinion, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has never made riba permissible for any religion. The religions that were before Islam, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has never made riba permissible for them. That means the riba was haram for all of the religions. It were the people who misused it and who made this as a tool for earning and suppressing the other people. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala help us save ourselves from riba or from any transaction that takes us to the dealing of riba. وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وبارك وسلم.